Ilara lived a life that felt like a book carefully placed back on a shelf, always in the right spot, never out of order. At 34, she had a job that suited her perfectly. She was a senior archivist at the city's main library, a quiet woman surrounded by the whispers of the past. Her world was one of climate-controlled rooms, soft cotton gloves, and the gentle scent of aging paper. She found comfort in the way she could take a chaotic box of donated documents and, with patience and care, turn it into a neatly labeled, accessible piece of history. Everything had its place. Everything had a story that could be filed away. Her home life was much the same. She shared a small, bright apartment with her husband, a kind man named Ben who worked with numbers and spreadsheets. He was a good man, steady and predictable. Their evenings followed a pleasant rhythm, the quiet clatter of her making dinner, the low murmur of the television news, the comfortable silence as they both read on the sofa before bed. It was a gentle hum of a life, safe and warm. There were no grand dramas, no sudden turns. Their love was not a fiery, passionate blaze, but more like the consistent low heat of a well-tended fire, reliable and comforting. Ilara told herself this was what she wanted. This was what happiness looked like. A well-organized life, free from messy surprises. One Saturday, the predictable rhythm was broken by a call from her father. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the city outside her window, and the call felt like an intrusion into her cozy, planned day. Her mother's voice, usually cheerful, sounded tired on the other end of the line. They were finally clearing out her grandmother's attic. It was a task they had put off for years, a dusty, emotional chore that no one wanted to face. Her grandmother, a woman who had seemed as permanent and sturdy as the old oak tree in her childhood backyard, had been gone for 2 years. The attic was the last frontier, the final hold of her presence. Her parents needed help. They needed her careful touch, her ability to sort and make sense of things. With a quiet sigh, Ilara agreed. She pulled on a raincoat and drove to her childhood home, a small brick house on a street full of memories. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust and mothballs, a smell that instantly transported her back to being a little girl, exploring the forbidden treasure trove of the attic. Her parents were already there, moving slowly amidst the shadows and stacked furniture. Her father looked overwhelmed, his usual energy replaced by a weary slump. Her mother was wiping her eyes with a tissue, a small, sad smile on her face as she held up a ceramic doll with a cracked face. Ilara's task was clear. She was to go through a large, dark wood trunk that had belonged to her grandmother. It sat in the corner like a sleeping beast, its metal hinges tarnished with age. Her father had tried to open it earlier but found it stuck. "It's probably just old linens and junk," he'd said, waving a dismissive hand. But Ilara felt a pull of curiosity. She liked trunks. They were stories waiting to be opened. She worked the old iron latch with her fingers, wiggling it back and forth until it gave a loud, protesting groan. The lid was heavy, and it lifted with the scent of cedar and thyme. Inside, just as her father had predicted, were layers of faded, yellowed linens. They were beautifully embroidered, the work of patient hands, but they smelled of stale air. Ilara began to lift them out, folding them neatly and placing them in a pile. Underneath the linens were old clothes, a wedding dress wrapped in plastic, and a box of black and white photographs. She paused for a moment, looking at a picture of her grandmother as a young woman. She was laughing, her head thrown back, full of a vibrant life that Ilara had only ever seen in glimpses. She kept digging, her hands moving through the layers of the past. At the very bottom, beneath a stack of moth-eaten quilts that felt like soft, heavy clouds, her fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. It was a small box, much smaller than the trunk, made of a dark, polished wood. It wasn't locked. There was no key, no clasp, just a simple lid that lifted off easily. Ilara felt a small thrill, the familiar excitement of an archivist on the verge of a discovery. Inside the box, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were a few pieces of tarnished silver jewelry and some colorful, cheap-looking pins. It was a typical collection of a lifetime's small trinkets. But beside the jewelry was a bundle of letters, tied together with a faded silk ribbon that had once been a deep blue, but was now the color of a pale evening sky. The paper of the envelopes was thick and creamy, the kind that isn't made anymore. They were all addressed to her grandmother, in the same elegant, flowing script. The postmarks were from a town she had never heard of, dated from a summer over 40 years ago. As she picked up the bundle, one letter slipped free from the silk ribbon. It fell onto her lap, a single forgotten piece of a much larger puzzle. Ilara hesitated. This felt private, like she was trespassing into a part of her grandmother's life that was never meant to be seen by anyone else. Her grandmother had always been a quiet, proper woman, a pillar of the family. What secrets could these letters possibly hold? But the curiosity was stronger than the guilt. It was the same feeling she got in the archives, the pull of an untold story. She told herself it was okay. She was just trying to understand the woman who had been at the center of her family. With a deep breath, she carefully unfolded the brittle paper. It was so old it felt like it might crumble in her hands. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the handwriting was still clear and beautiful. She began to read. The letter started with a simple, "My dearest Eleanor," but the words that followed were not simple at all. They were filled with a warmth and an intimacy that made Ilara's breath catch in her throat. The writer spoke of stolen moments, of the way the sun felt on their skin, of a shared joke that no one else would understand. He wrote about a future they were planning, a small house by the sea, a life filled with art and laughter. It was the language of a deep, all-consuming love. Ilara's heart began to beat a little faster. She looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was just a first name, Julian. The name meant nothing to her. She had never heard her grandmother mention a Julian. Her grandmother's story, the one Ilara had always been told, was a simple one. She had met her grandfather, a kind and steady man named Thomas, at a church social. They had dated, fallen in love, and married. It was a story of quiet devotion, of a simple, happy life. There was no room in that story for a passionate, secret romance with a man named Julian. She read the letter again, her eyes scanning the words, trying to make sense of them. The writer, Julian, spoke of dreams and desires that seemed so out of character for the grandmother she knew. He described her as a wildflower, a woman with a fire in her soul that the world couldn't tame. This was not the quiet, reserved woman who had baked cookies and tended to her garden. This was a stranger. Ilara felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a sense of betrayal, as if a foundational story of her life had been a lie. But there was also a flicker of something else, a fascination. Who was this woman? And what had happened to Julian? The attic around her seemed to fade away. The sound of the rain on the roof, the movements of her parents in the background, it all became a distant muffle. Her entire world had shrunk to the single, fragile piece of paper in her hands. She was holding a secret that had been hidden for over 40 years. A secret that had been tucked away in a dusty box and forgotten. As she sat there on the floor of the attic, a single folded letter in her hand, she had a sudden, powerful feeling. This was not just a forgotten piece of mail. This was a key, and she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that it was a key that would unlock a door to a past that would change everything she thought she knew about her family and about herself. The world came back into focus slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. The sound of her father coughing from across the attic, the musty smell of old wood, the feeling of the rough floorboards through her jeans, it all returned with a jolt. Ilara quickly folded the letter, her hands feeling clumsy and large. The paper, which had felt so precious moments before, now seemed dangerous, like a live wire she was holding. She slipped it back into its envelope and placed it carefully on top of the bundle, tying the faded silk ribbon around it as if sealing a wound. She closed the small wooden box and pushed it deep under the quilts, burying the secret once again. But she couldn't bury it in her mind. For the rest of the afternoon, she worked on autopilot. She sorted through old clothes, her hands moving while her thoughts were miles away, or rather years away. She saw her grandmother's face in her mind's eye. Not the soft, wrinkled face of her old age, but the laughing, vibrant face from the photograph. Who was that woman? Who was this Julian who wrote of a life by the sea and a fire in her soul? The grandmother she knew, Eleanor, was a woman of quiet routines. Her greatest adventure was trying a new recipe for rhubarb pie. The idea of her being a wildflower was absurd, and yet the words on the page had felt so true, so full of life. When she got home that evening, the apartment felt different. The familiar comfort of her tidy space now felt like a cage, a neat, orderly box that was hiding something messy and complicated. Ben was already there, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. He smiled. When he saw her, a warm, easy smile that usually made her feel safe. Tonight it just felt like he was a character in a different story, a story that was no longer her own. Long day? he asked, tasting the soup with a spoon. Ilara just nodded, not trusting her own voice. She couldn't tell him. How could she even begin? Oh, by the way, I found a letter in the attic that suggests Grandma was in love with another man and our entire family history is a fairy tale. The words sounded crazy even in her head. She knew Ben. He was a man of facts and figures. He would listen patiently, then he would try to reason it out. Maybe it was just a friend, he would say. Maybe she was misreading it. He wouldn't understand the feeling, the intuitive certainty that this letter was the tip of a very large, very hidden iceberg. That night, sleep was a long way off. She lay in bed next to Ben, listening to his soft, even breathing, and felt more alone than she had in her entire life. The letter had created a wall between her and the world she knew. She was now the keeper of a secret that wasn't hers to keep, a secret that changed the very foundation of her family. She thought about her grandfather, Thomas, a man she had adored. He was a gentle, quiet man who had clearly worshipped his wife. Had he known? Or had he lived his whole life in the dark, loving a woman whose heart was somewhere else with a man named Julian? The thought was a physical pain, a sharp ache in her chest. The next day was Sunday. She went through the motions of her routine, but her mind was a whirlwind. She couldn't focus on the book she tried to read. The words swam on the page, replaced by the elegant script of the letter. She felt a desperate need to know more. She needed context. She needed to understand. Her parents were having their usual Sunday dinner and she knew she had to go. She felt like a spy walking into her own childhood home. Her mother was setting the table, humming a little tune. Her father was reading the newspaper in his armchair. Everything looked so normal, so perfectly preserved. It made Ilara want to scream. She waited until they were eating, until the conversation had moved from work to the neighbor's new lawnmower. She tried to sound casual, keeping her voice light and airy. "You know, I was thinking about Grandma yesterday," she began, her heart thumping against her ribs. "I was looking at that old photo of her, the one from before she was married. She seemed so full of life." Her mother smiled, a nostalgic look in her eyes. "Oh, she was. She had a wonderful spirit." "I was just wondering," Ilara continued, trying to steer the conversation without being too obvious. "What was she like back then? Before she met Grandpa? Did she ever talk about it?" Her father lowered his fork. "Well, she was always your grandmother," he said with a chuckle. "Kind, sweet. No, I mean, did she ever travel? Did she have any adventures?" The word felt strange on her tongue. Her mother paused, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know, she did. For one summer. Before she met your grandfather. She went to Italy for a few months. To study art, I think. She always loved to paint. Italy." The word landed in the middle of the dinner table like a stone. Ilara felt a jolt, an electric shock of connection. The postmark on the letter. She hadn't paid close attention, but it could have been from Italy. An artist. Julian, the man who wrote of a life filled with art. "Italy," Ilara repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. "That's amazing. I never knew that." "What was it like?" "Oh, she didn't talk about it much," her mother said, waving a hand as if it were a minor detail. "It was just a short trip a long time ago. She came home, met your grandfather at a church picnic that fall, and that was that. The rest is history. The rest is history." The phrase hung in the air, heavy with irony. Ilara knew now that the history her mother was talking about was the cleaned-up, edited version. The real story was still hidden in a box in the attic. She had a name for the secret now, Italy, and a purpose, art. It wasn't much, but it was a thread, and she knew she had to pull on it. She couldn't eat another bite. Her food tasted like cardboard. She excused herself, claiming a headache, and drove home in a daze. The moment she walked through the door of her apartment, she knew what she had to do. She had to go back. She had to see the other letters. The next day, she called her mother from work, making up an excuse about a book she had forgotten to return from the attic. She said she would stop by after her shift at the library. The whole day at the archives was torture. She was surrounded by stories, but the only one she cared about was locked away in her grandmother's trunk. She kept her hands busy, cataloging a collection of old city maps, but her mind was in that dusty attic, her fingers itching to touch that bundle of letters. As soon as her shift was over, she drove to her parents' house, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. The house was empty. They were both at their weekly bowling league. She had the place to herself. She climbed the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the quiet house. The attic was just as she had left it, a dusty, shadowed world frozen in time. She went straight to the trunk. She pulled out the heavy quilts, her hands shaking slightly, and lifted the small wooden box from its hiding place. This time there was no hesitation. She untied the faded silk ribbon and let the bundle of letters spill into her lap. There were at least a dozen of them, all in the same elegant handwriting, all addressed to her grandmother. She picked up the one on top, dated a month after the first one she had read. She sank onto the floor, her back against a stack of old chairs, and began to read. This letter was even more intimate than the first. Julian wrote about the small apartment they shared in Florence, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs, the way the light hit the Duomo at sunset. He wrote about her paintings, about the talent he saw in her, the fire he wanted the world to see. He called her his muse, his other half. He wasn't just a boyfriend. He was a partner, a soulmate. Ilara read one letter after another, lost in the world they created. Each letter was a piece of a puzzle, and slowly a picture began to form. It wasn't just a summer fling. It was a deep, profound love affair. They had planned a life together. He was an American artist, and he wanted her to come back to New York with him, to build a life, to paint, to be together. She reached the last letter in the bundle. Her hands were trembling so much she could barely unfold it. The paper was different, thinner, and the handwriting was less elegant, more rushed, as if it had been written in a hurry. The date was from the end of that summer. The tone was completely different. The warmth was gone, replaced by a desperate, heartbreaking sadness. He wrote that he couldn't believe she was leaving. He pleaded with her to reconsider, to not let fear win. He wrote that he had an exhibition, a real chance to make a name for himself, and he couldn't do it without her. He begged her to meet him at the train station, to just get on the train with him and not look back. The letter ended with a sentence that made a tear roll down Ilara's cheek. "I will wait for you at the station until the last train has left. If you are not there, I will know that I have lost the other half of my soul." Ilara sat there in the silent attic, the letter clutched in her hand, and she finally understood. Her grandmother hadn't just left Italy. She had left Julian. She had been at that train station, and she had made a choice. She had chosen to go back home to the safe, predictable life her family expected of her. She had chosen to let her other half go. The quiet, devoted woman she knew was not the whole person. She was a woman who had made a terrible, heartbreaking choice, and had lived with the quiet echo of it for the rest of her life. The secret wasn't just a secret romance. It was a story of a great sacrifice, a life unlived, and Ilara was the first person in 40 years to know the truth. The attic no longer felt like a place of forgotten memories. It now felt like a crime scene, and Ilara was the only one who knew a crime had been committed. The crime wasn't against the law, but against the heart. She carefully placed the last letter back into its envelope, her fingers tracing the faded ink of Julian's desperate plea. The image of him waiting at a train station in a foreign country, his hope fading with each passing minute, was burned into her mind. She gathered the bundle, tied the silk ribbon with a reverence usually reserved for sacred texts, and placed the small wooden box back under the quilts. But the secret was out of the box now. It was inside her, a heavy, living thing. Driving home, the world outside the car window seemed like a movie she wasn't a part of. People walked their dogs, children rode their bikes. Life went on in its simple, uncomplicated way. But Ilara's world had been tilted on its axis. She felt a strange new connection to every person she saw, wondering what hidden heartbreaks they were carrying, what untold stories were tucked away behind their everyday faces. She had always seen life as a series of facts to be organized and filed away. Now she saw it as a tapestry of stories, some told, some buried, all woven together with threads of love, loss, and choice. She couldn't go back to her normal life. The next few days were a blur. At the library, she would stare at the old documents in front of her, but her mind was in Florence, picturing her grandmother, a young woman with paint on her fingers and a secret in her heart. She would find herself lost in thought, her hands hovering over a keyboard, until a colleague would ask her a question and she would jolt back to reality. She felt like she was living a double life. On the outside, she was Ilara the archivist, the quiet, dependable wife. On the inside, she was a detective, piecing together a mystery that was decades old. The weight of the secret was becoming too much to carry alone. She felt like she was betraying her father by keeping this from him. He had adored his mother, and his whole understanding of her was built on a foundation that Alara now knew was cracked. But how could she tell him? It would be like telling him the sky wasn't blue. It would shatter the peaceful image of the woman he had loved and mourned. She decided she needed more information before she could even think about telling anyone. She needed proof, context, something to hold on to besides the passionate words of a lovelorn artist. She became a researcher in her own family's history. She started with the photo albums at her parents' house, looking for any pictures from that summer. She found a few. There was one of her grandmother standing in front of a large fountain, a small, hesitant smile on her face. In the background, a blur of people. Alara took the photo, her heart pounding, and scanned it into her computer at home. She zoomed in, her eyes scanning every face in the crowd. And then she saw him. A young man with a mop of dark, curly hair looking not at the camera, but directly at her grandmother. He had a gentle, artistic look about him, and even in the blurry, faded image she could see the adoration in his eyes. It had to be him. It was Julian. Seeing his face made the whole story terrifyingly real. Her next step was the internet, a tool her grandmother could never have imagined. She typed in American artist Florence 1978. It was a long shot, a needle in a digital haystack. Pages and pages of results came up. She spent hours, then days, scrolling through galleries, art history sites, and old exhibition catalogs. She felt like she was going crazy, chasing a ghost. But then late one night she found it. A small obscure art blog had a post about a forgotten American expressionist from the 70s. There was a black and white photo of the artist, and it was him. The same face from the background of the fountain picture. His name was Julian. The blog mentioned a few exhibitions in New York in the early 80s and a famous series of paintings called The Florentine Summer. The blog post ended by saying that he had largely disappeared from the art world after the mid-80s. Living a reclusive life, Alara's hands were shaking. She had found him. He was real. She followed a few more links and found an old interview with him from a small art magazine published around the time of his first big show. The interviewer asked him about his inspiration. He talked about a woman he had met in Italy, a woman he described as his muse and my great love. He said, "She taught me what it was to truly see the world, and then she taught me what it was to lose it. My best work and my greatest pain all come from her." Reading those words, Alara felt a profound sense of sadness for both of them. Her grandmother hadn't just broken her own heart. She had broken his. She had walked away from a man who had built an entire career around the memory of her. The story was no longer just a family secret. It was a tragic love story that had rippled out into the world. A story that was hidden in plain sight on the internet for anyone to find. If only they knew what to look for. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself anymore. The secret had grown too big, too heavy. It was changing her, making her see her own life, her own safe and predictable choices in a new light. She looked at her husband Ben and wondered if he had any what-ifs in his past. She looked at her own reflection and wondered if she was living a life that was true to herself, or if she was just following a script, the same way her grandmother had. She had to talk to her mother. Her mother was the bridge between her grandmother's past and her own. She was the one who had known her best. She decided to do it on a Saturday, over a cup of tea in the bright, cheerful kitchen of her childhood home. It felt like the right place, a place that had always been full of warmth and honesty. Her mother was bustling around, making cookies, the scent of cinnamon and sugar filling the air. Alara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, her heart hammering against her ribs. She waited for the right moment, but she knew there would never be a right moment. "Mom," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Can I ask you something about Grandma?" Her mother stopped mixing the dough and looked at her, a gentle smile on her face. "Of course, dear." "What is it?" Alara took a deep breath. "When you were cleaning out her things, did you ever find anything unusual? Any letters or anything from when she was young?" Her mother's smile faltered. She looked down at the bowl in front of her, her hands still. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt thick and heavy. She didn't seem surprised. She seemed resigned. "What do you mean, dear?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I mean, from before she met Grandpa." From her trip to Italy, her mother let out a long, slow breath. She put down the mixing spoon and wiped her hands on her apron. She pulled out a chair and sat down opposite Alara. her eyes filled with a deep, weary sadness that Alara had never seen before. "Your grandmother told me about him," she said softly, a few years before she passed away. "We were sitting in the garden one afternoon and she just started talking. It was like a dam had broken." Alara stared at her, stunned. She had been prepared for shock, for denial, for tears of disbelief. She was not prepared for this. "She told me everything," her mother continued, her voice trembling slightly, "about Julian, about their love, about the life they planned. She said she had carried it with her for all those years and she didn't want to take it to her grave. She made me promise not to tell your father. She didn't want to tarnish his memory of her, or his memory of his own father." Tears started to well up in her mother's eyes. "She said she loved your grandfather, Alara, she truly did. He was a good, kind man who gave her a stable, happy life. But a part of her heart was always in Florence with Julian. She lived with a quiet melancholy her whole life, a sense of, what if? Your grandfather sensed it, I think, but he never knew what it was. He just knew she was a woman with a deep well of sadness inside her, and he loved her through it." Alara reached across the table and took her mother's hand. The secret was out, but it wasn't the explosive revelation she had feared. It was a quiet, shared sorrow. She wasn't the sole keeper of the secret anymore. She and her mother were now linked by this knowledge, this understanding of the woman they had both loved. As they sat there, holding hands and crying softly, Alara felt a shift inside her. The story of her grandmother was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a truth to be honored. It was the story of a woman who had made a choice, a painful, difficult choice, and had lived with the consequences. It was a story of love and loss, of dreams and reality. And in that moment, Alara knew that this story wasn't just about her grandmother. It was about her, too. It was about the choices we all make, the paths we take, and the ghosts of the lives we didn't live. The discovery hadn't just uncovered a family secret. It had uncovered a universal truth, and it was a truth that would change her entire life. The tears that fell in the bright, warm kitchen were not tears of shock, but of release. They were a cleansing rain, washing away years of unspoken history. For Alara, the immense pressure of being the sole keeper of this monumental secret finally lifted. She looked at her mother, not just as her parent, but as a fellow witness to a beautiful, heartbreaking story. The woman who had baked her cookies and bandaged her knees was also the guardian of her own mother's profound regret. It was a heavy burden, and Alara felt a wave of admiration for the quiet strength it must have taken to carry it alone. They sat there for a long time, the forgotten cookie dough sitting on the counter, the scent of cinnamon now mingled with the salt of their tears. Her mother spoke more, filling in the gaps with the quiet details her grandmother had shared. She spoke of her grandmother's quiet moments staring out the window on a summer afternoon, a faint, sad smile on her lips. She spoke of how her grandmother had encouraged her own artistic pursuits as a teenager, not with the hope of her becoming famous, but with the deep understanding that creating something beautiful was a way to heal a part of yourself. "She always told me," her mother said, her voice thick with emotion, "that it was never too late to be the person you might have been. I never really understood what she meant until now." The secret, once a source of isolation, had become a bridge. It connected Alara to her mother in a way she had never experienced. They were no longer just a mother and a daughter. They were two women, bound by blood and by the shared knowledge of a love that had shaped their family in invisible ways. The story of Eleanor and Julian was no longer just a mystery from the past. It was a living, breathing part of their own story. Driving home that evening, the world looked different again. The gray, heavy feeling that had settled over her was gone, replaced by a lightness, a sense of clarity. She wasn't just carrying a secret anymore. She was carrying a legacy of love, of choice, and of the quiet courage it takes to live with the consequences of your own heart. She felt a new, profound love for her grandmother, a love for the whole, complicated, beautiful person she had been, not just the gentle, one-dimensional woman she had remembered. When she walked into her apartment, Ben was on the sofa, reading a book. He looked up and smiled, and for the first time, Alara didn't feel a wall between them. She saw him not as a character in a different story, but as her partner, the person she had chosen to build a life with. And she realized, with a jolt of insight, that her grandmother's story wasn't just a tragedy. It was also a story about the love that comes after. Her grandfather, Thomas, had loved a woman who carried a ghost in her heart. He had loved her through her quiet melancholy, her moments of distance without ever knowing the source. His love was not the fiery, passionate love of a summer in Florence, but it was a deep, steady, enduring love. It was the love of a man who chose to be with the woman in front of him, ghosts and all. She sat down next to Ben and he put his book down, sensing that something was different. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Alara took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't tell him everything. It wasn't her story to tell in its entirety. But she could tell him her part of it. She could share the change that was happening inside her. "I went to my parents' house today," she began, her voice a little shaky. "I found some old letters of my grandmother's." Ben listened patiently, his eyes focused on hers. She didn't tell him about Julian or the train station or the art gallery in New York. Instead, she told him about the woman she was discovering. "I always thought of her as just Grandma, sweet, quiet, simple. But she wasn't. She was so much more. She had dreams, she had passions, she had this whole life before the life I knew. It made me think." "Think about what?" he asked softly. "About us," she said, the words feeling both scary and liberating. "About our life. I love our life, Ben. I love the comfort and the safety. But sometimes I worry that we're just comfortable. That we're not really living, just existing. That we have our own what-ifs that we never talk about." Ben was quiet for a moment, processing what she was saying. He was a man of logic, but he was also a man who loved her. He could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the raw honesty of her words. "I think about that sometimes," he admitted, his voice low. "I think about that band I was in college. How I used to stay up all night writing songs. I haven't picked up my guitar in years." The confession hung in the air between them, a small shared secret of their own. It was a crack in the wall of their predictable routine, a tiny opening where something new could grow. "We should change that," Alara said, a small smile playing on her lips. "We should both change that." The conversation was the beginning of a new chapter in their marriage. It wasn't a dramatic, movie-style transformation. It was a slow, gentle shift, like the turning of a season. A few days later, Ben came home with his old guitar, its case covered in a fine layer of dust. That evening, instead of turning on the television, he sat in the corner of the living room and tentatively picked at the strings, slowly relearning the chords of a song he hadn't played in 20 years. The sound was a little rusty, a little out of tune, but it was the most beautiful sound Alara had ever heard. It was the sound of a forgotten dream being awakened. Inspired by his courage, Alara decided to take her own step. She thought about Julian, the artist, and the way he had seen the fire in her grandmother's soul. She thought about her own forgotten passions. She had always loved working with her hands, creating things. In college, she had taken a pottery class and had loved the feeling of the cool, wet clay spinning beneath her fingers, the way she could transform a lump of earth into something beautiful and useful. She had let it go, telling herself she didn't have time, that it was just a hobby. The next weekend, she found a local community center that offered a pottery class. She signed up on the spot, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. Walking into the studio for the first time, she felt like an imposter. The room was filled with people who seemed to know what they were doing, their hands confidently shaping the clay. But the instructor, a woman with kind eyes and clay smudged on her cheeks, welcomed her and showed her the basics. When Alara sat down at the wheel for the first time, her hands were clumsy. The clay wobbled and collapsed, a formless mess. But she didn't give up. She thought of her grandmother, choosing the safe path, and she thought of Julian begging her to take a chance. She centered the clay again, took a deep breath, and let her hands find their own rhythm. She wasn't trying to create a masterpiece. She was just trying to feel, to connect with a part of herself she had buried a long time ago. As the wet clay began to rise beneath her fingers, forming a small, imperfect bowl, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was it. This was the change. It wasn't about leaving her life or finding a new one. It was about finding the life that was already there, waiting to be lived. It was about honoring the what-ifs, not by regretting them, but by turning them into why-nots. The discovery of the letters had started as a journey into the past, but it had led her right back to her own present. It had taught her that a life isn't just one big story, but a collection of small choices, small moments of courage. It had taught her that love isn't just one grand passion, but the quiet daily act of choosing the person beside you and choosing to help them become the person they were meant to be. The secret of her grandmother's past hadn't just uncovered a family tragedy. It had unlocked a future for Alara, a future that was a little less predictable, a little less safe, and a whole lot more alive. The change in their home was not loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, subtle shift, like the way the light changes in a room as the seasons turn. The television, which had once been the constant humming center of their evenings, was now often off. In its place was the gentle, sometimes clumsy sound of a guitar being relearned. Ben would sit in his corner, his brow furrowed in concentration, his fingers finding their way back to the chords of his youth. He wasn't writing new songs yet, just rediscovering the old ones, but the music filled their small apartment with a new kind of energy. It was the sound of a forgotten part of him coming back to life. For Alara, the change was a tangible, messy, and wonderful reality. Her hands, once so clean and dry from handling old documents, were now often smudged with clay. A corner of their living room had been claimed by her new passion, populated by a few lopsided beginner's pots and bowls. They weren't perfect. In fact, they were far from it. The rims were wobbly, the sides uneven, but to Alara they were the most beautiful objects in the world. Each one was a small victory, a physical representation of a choice she had made to not just exist, but to create. One evening, she was trying to center a particularly stubborn lump of clay on her small, home pottery wheel. It wobbled violently, collapsing into a formless mess for the third time. She let out a frustrated sigh, slumping back in her chair. Ben put down his guitar and came over, wiping his hands on his jeans. He didn't say anything, just watched her for a moment. "It's harder than it looks," she said, a small smile on her face. "Everything worth doing is," he replied softly. He reached out and gently touched the wet clay, then her cheek, leaving a faint smear of gray. "You have clay on your face." She laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt new and unfamiliar. "So do you," she said, pointing to a smudge on his own chin. In that moment, surrounded by the evidence of their fledgling dreams, they felt more connected than ever. They were no longer just two people living a comfortable, predictable life. They were partners in a new adventure, cheering each other on as they stumbled and learned. The story of her grandmother, however, was not finished for Alara. It lived inside her, a constant, gentle presence. She felt a responsibility to it, a need to honor it in a more complete way. She had shared the secret with her mother, and it had brought them closer. She had let it change her own life, and it had brought her and Ben closer. But there was still one person whose story felt incomplete: Julian. She would often find herself thinking about him, the artist from the old blog post. She would wonder what had happened to him after his success in the 80s. The blog had said he'd become a recluse. Had he ever found love again? Had he ever stopped painting? Or had he spent the rest of his life creating art inspired by the ghost of a woman he lost at a train station in Italy? The thought of him living out his days alone, haunted by a love that was as real to him as the air he breathed, was a heavy weight on her heart. One rainy afternoon, when the clay was too wet to work with and the strings of Ben's guitar were too damp for a clear sound, Alara found herself at her computer, the old art blog post pulled up on the screen. She read the interview again, her heart aching for the young man who had poured his pain onto a canvas. On a whim, she typed his name into a search engine, adding the word artist and New York. She scrolled through pages of gallery archives and auction results for his early work. It was all from the past. She was about to give up when she saw a small, obscure link to a website for a coastal art colony in a small town in Maine. She clicked on it. The website was simple, with a page for resident artists, and there, under a list of visiting faculty for a summer workshop, was his name. It was him. The photo was recent, showing an older man with the same dark, curly hair now streaked with silver, and the same gentle, artistic eyes. He was looking directly at the camera, and there was a deep sadness in his gaze, but also a sense of peace. The website listed an email address for inquiries about the workshop. Alara's heart started to pound. This was crazy. It was one thing to uncover a family secret. It was another thing entirely to reach out across decades and make contact with a living, breathing part of that secret. What would she even say? "Hello, I'm the granddaughter of the woman who broke your heart 40 years ago. How are you?" It was absurd. And yet she felt a powerful pull, a sense that this was something she had to do, not for herself but for her grandmother and for him. To close a circle that had been left open for too long. She thought about it for days. She drafted and deleted a dozen emails. They all felt wrong, too intrusive, too dramatic. Finally, she decided to keep it simple. She didn't mention the letters or the train station or the heartbreak. She just wrote from the heart. She wrote that she was an archivist and that she had recently come across some information about her grandmother's early life as an artist in Florence. She wrote that she had discovered his work and was deeply moved by it. She wrote that her grandmother had spoken of her time in Italy with great fondness and that she thought he would like to know that the memory of that summer had been cherished her whole life. She didn't sign it with her full name, just Ilara, and she didn't mention her family connection. She just wanted to send a small piece of kindness across the years, a message that his love had not been forgotten, that it had lived on in the quiet moments of a woman's life. She hit send before she could talk herself out of it, and then immediately regretted it, feeling a wave of anxiety wash over her. A week went by with no reply. Ilara told herself she had been foolish to expect one. He was an old man, a recluse. He probably didn't even check his email. She tried to put it out of her mind and focus on her own life, on the growing pile of imperfect pots in her living room, and the new melody Ben was working on. Then one evening, an email appeared in her inbox. The subject line was just her name, Ilara. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The message was short, simple, and incredibly kind. "Thank you for your message," it read. "It was a lovely surprise to hear from you. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, and that summer was a gift that has informed my entire life and my work. I am so glad to know that she remembered it with fondness. It means more than you can know. All the best, Julian." Ilara read the email over and over, tears streaming down her face. There was no bitterness, no anger. There was just a quiet, graceful acceptance. He had found peace. The love story hadn't ended in tragedy. It had simply transformed into a beautiful, poignant memory that had fueled a lifetime of art. It was the final piece of the puzzle. Her grandmother hadn't just made a choice out of fear. She had made a choice, and both she and Julian had found a way to live with it, to honor it in their own ways. With that final piece of the story in place, Ilara felt a profound sense of peace. The journey that had begun in a dusty attic was complete. She had uncovered a secret, but in doing so she had uncovered so much more. She had uncovered the complexity of the human heart, the courage it takes to make a choice, and the enduring power of a love that was never meant to last. Her life was not the same. It was richer, deeper, and more vibrant. The predictable rhythms were still there, but they were now infused with a new energy, a new sense of possibility. She and Ben were still the same people, but they were more honest with each other, more supportive of each other's dreams. They were building a life that was not just comfortable, but truly alive. One sunny afternoon, Ilara was in her little pottery corner, working on a new vase. The clay was spinning smoothly beneath her hands, rising into a graceful, even shape. Ben was in the living room, playing a new melody on his guitar, a melody that was hopeful and bright. The apartment was filled with the scent of drying clay and the sound of music. It was a simple moment, a perfect moment. Ilara looked at her hands shaping the clay and thought of her grandmother. She thought of the young woman with the fire in her soul, and the older woman with the quiet sadness in her eyes. And she smiled. She was living the answer to her grandmother's unspoken question. It was never too late to be the person you might have been. The letter had changed her entire life, not by revealing a shocking secret from the past, but by showing her how to truly live in the present.